For 15 years, the man behind the wheel of the number 12 bus had felt the city's pulse through the groan of its engine and the hiss of its pneumatic doors. His world was a rectangle of glass framed by steel, a moving stage where the same play unfolded every day, just with slightly different actors. He knew the rhythm of the streets, the way the traffic lights blinked in a familiar, lazy sequence on a Tuesday afternoon, and the exact spot where the sun would glare through the windshield, forcing him to pull down the sun visor with a well-practiced flick of his wrist. He was a silent observer, a keeper of 1,000 fleeting faces. There was the woman who always sat in the same seat and knitted scarves, even in summer. There was the old man who carried a radio that crackled with baseball games, his face a mask of concentration. And then there were the children, loud and full of energy, a chaotic splash of color in the otherwise muted tones of the daily commute. But a few months ago, a new face had entered his world, and it had quietly taken root in his mind. It was the face of a little girl, a small wisp of a child who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. She boarded alone every weekday afternoon at the stop just outside the Grand City Library. Rain or shine, she would be there, her small hand clutching the strap of a backpack that looked almost as big as she was. She would climb the tall steps with a determined effort, her small legs pumping, and place her crumpled bus fare into the coin dispenser with the seriousness of a grown-up paying a bill. She never said a word, not even a quiet hello or thank you. She would just offer a brief, polite nod, her eyes wide and fixed on some point just past his shoulder, before making her way down the aisle. Her destination was always the same. The third row from the back, the window seat on the right-hand side. It was as if that seat had her name on it, an invisible reservation waiting for her each day. She would slide into it, her feet barely touching the floor, and shrug the heavy backpack off her shoulders, letting it thump softly onto the seat beside her. For the first few minutes she would just sit there, her head turned towards the window, watching the world slide by in a smear of gray buildings and green trees. The man would watch her in his large rearview mirror, his eyes flicking from the road ahead to her small, still form. At first he didn't think much of it. Just another child on her way home from a long day at school or the library. But then the tears would begin. They weren't loud, dramatic sobs that would draw the attention of other passengers. They were silent, almost invisible at first. He noticed the way her small shoulders would start to tremble, a slight, rhythmic shake. Then he would see her raise a hand to her cheek, a quick, furtive gesture as if to wipe something away. In the reflection of the window, he could see the tracks of the tears glistening on her pale skin. She would stare straight ahead, her body rigid, fighting a battle only she could see. She never made a sound. There was no sniffling, no whimpering, just the quiet, heartbreaking dance of her shoulders and the constant, silent stream of tears running down her face. Day after day the scene repeated itself. It became a part of his route, a painful punctuation mark in his afternoon. The man found himself dreading the library stop, not because he didn't want to see her, but because it hurt to see her so sad. He was a father, and later a grandfather, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to stop the bus, to walk back there, to kneel down and ask her what was wrong. But he was a professional, bound by the invisible rules of his job. He was the driver. She was a passenger. There was a line he knew he shouldn't cross. What if he frightened her? What if she was just a sensitive child who was sad about a lost toy or a bad grade? What if he made things worse by drawing attention to her private pain? So he watched and he worried. He started to notice other things. Her clothes were always clean, but they looked worn and faded, the colors washed out after too many trips through a washing machine. The sleeves of her little jacket were a little too short, revealing her wrists. She never had a snack or a drink, never pulled out a phone or a game to pass the time. She just sat there, lost in her world of sorrow, her small frame swallowed by the big green seat. Her backpack, when she occasionally opened it to pull out a book, seemed to be filled with more than just school supplies. It looked heavy, weighted down with something more than just paper and pencils. One afternoon, he tried to break the silence. As she handed him her fare, he gave her what he hoped was his kindest, most non-threatening smile. "It's a bit chilly today, isn't it?" he said, his voice sounding louder than he intended in the quiet hum of the bus. The little girl froze. She looked up at him, her eyes, which he could now see were the color of a clear summer sky, filled with a sudden sharp panic. She just stared for a second, her mouth slightly open, before giving a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head and rushing to her usual seat. The man felt a pang of guilt. He had scared her. He had broken the fragile bubble of her world, and not in a good way. From that day on, she was even more careful to avoid his gaze, keeping her head down as she paid and scurrying to her seat, as if he were a monster she needed to escape. He felt a heavy helplessness settle over him. He was in charge of this 40-foot vehicle, in charge of the safety of dozens of people, but he couldn't do a single thing to help one small, crying girl. He was just the driver, a faceless part of her daily routine. But as he watched her in the mirror that day, her small body shaking with silent sobs, he knew that he couldn't just be the driver anymore. Not to her. The sight of her tears had become a call to action, a quiet but persistent alarm bell ringing in his heart. He had to find a way to help, a way to cross that line without scaring her, a way to understand the source of her pain. He didn't know how yet, but he knew he had to do something. His simple, predictable world had just become a whole lot more complicated. The days that followed felt different to the man behind the wheel. The city was the same, the bus route was the same, the groan of the engine and the sigh of the air brakes were the same, but his focus had narrowed to a single point in his rearview mirror. The little girl. Her silent sorrow had become a constant weight in his chest, a heavy stone that grew a little heavier each afternoon at 3:15. He found himself watching for her long before her stop, his eyes scanning the sidewalk for her small figure. He felt like a guardian of a secret he didn't even know, a silent partner in her daily grief. The other passengers, the traffic, the noise of the city, it all faded into the background, a dull hum compared to the silent, heartbreaking signal of her trembling shoulders. His concern deepened as the season began to turn. The crisp, sunny afternoons of early fall gave way to chilly, gray November days. One afternoon, a cold, persistent rain began to fall, turning the streets into a shimmering, blurry mess. When the bus pulled up to the library stop, he saw her standing there, holding a small, flimsy umbrella that was being whipped around by the wind. It was doing little to keep her dry. She boarded the bus, her hair plastered to her forehead, her thin jacket soaked through. She was shivering, her small teeth chattering almost silently as she made her way to her seat. He watched as she sat down, not even bothering to take off her wet jacket. She just wrapped her arms around herself, a small, lonely island of misery in the vast sea of empty seats. The sight of her, so cold and so small, made his heart ache. He wanted to offer her a blanket or a cup of hot coffee, anything to chase away the chill that seemed to come from more than just the rain. A few days later, he tried again. He had an idea that felt less direct than asking her a question. He kept a small tin of hard candies on his dashboard, a little treat for himself on long shifts. As she handed him her fare, he opened the tin and held it out to her. "Would you like one?" he asked, trying to make his voice as soft and friendly as possible. "They're cherry." The little girl looked at the tin, then at his face. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of interest in her eyes, a child's natural curiosity. But it was quickly replaced by that same look of panic he had seen before. Her eyes widened, and she shook her head quickly, almost violently, before turning and practically running to her seat. He sighed softly, closing the tin. It was another failed attempt, another reminder of the invisible wall she had built around herself. He wasn't just a driver to her. He was a potential threat, an unknown adult who had broken her routine. He understood, but it didn't make the sting of rejection any less painful. He was just trying to be kind, but his kindness was being interpreted as something to fear. He started paying even closer attention to the details, piecing together a puzzle with only a few scattered pieces. He noticed that she never got off at the main bus terminal in the city center, where most children would transfer to another bus to go home. Her stop was always the last one on the route, a quiet residential street on the far edge of town. It was a long ride for someone so small. He also noticed how she struggled with her backpack. One day, as the bus took a sharp turn, she stumbled, and the backpack, which she had been holding on her lap, slid to the floor. It hit the ground with a surprisingly heavy thud, not the soft sound of books and papers. She scrambled to pick it up, her face flushing with embarrassment, clutching it to her chest as if it contained the most precious treasures in the world. It was more than just school supplies, he was sure of it. It was a burden, a physical manifestation of whatever emotional weight she was carrying, the turning point. The moment his worry turned into a quiet alarm came on a bright, cold Tuesday. The air was crisp, and the low afternoon sun cast long shadows across the bus. The little girl seemed more distracted than usual. She was fidgeting in her seat, looking at her watch, a small plastic thing with cartoon characters on it. As the bus approached her stop, she began to gather her things in a rush. She stood up a bit too early, just as the bus was slowing down, but before it had come to a complete stop. In her haste, a large, hardcover book slipped from her arms and slid onto the floor with a loud smack. It landed open, its pages splayed out. The man had already opened the doors. The girl, her face a mask of panic, bent down to grab it. But as she did, something else fell out from between the pages. It was a small, flimsy piece of paper, a pale blue strip that fluttered to the floor like a wounded bird. The man saw it instantly. It was a hospital visitor's bracelet. The kind they give you when you go to see someone, a paper band with sticky ends that you wear around your wrist. The girl saw it at the same time he did. Her eyes went wide with a terror that was so raw and so real it made the man catch his breath. She forgot all about the book. She lunged for the bracelet, snatching it from the floor and clutching it in her fist so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't even look at him. She just grabbed her book, shoved it into her backpack, and fled the bus, running down the street as if something terrible was chasing her. The man stood there for a moment, the bus doors still open, the cold air blowing into the warm cabin. He stared at the empty seat where she had been sitting, the hospital bracelet. It was a clue, a tiny piece of evidence that explained so much. The sadness, the secrecy, the heavy backpack, the long ride to the edge of town. It wasn't a lost toy or a bad grade. It wasn't simple childhood sadness. It was something real, something serious, something that involved a hospital. The weight in his chest suddenly felt heavier, more defined. This was no longer just a growing concern. It was a full-blown worry, a quiet but urgent need to understand. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he couldn't just watch anymore. He had to do something. He had to find out what was under that seat. The sight of the pale blue bracelet disappearing into the girl's fist was like a spark to a dry forest. It ignited a fire of urgency in the man's chest that burned away all his hesitation. The rest of his route that afternoon was a blur. He went through the motions, stopping, starting, opening the doors, closing them, but his mind was not on the road. It was back there, in the third row, replaying the scene of the girl's panicked escape over and over again. The hospital bracelet? It was a piece of a puzzle he hadn't even known he was trying to solve, and now it was the only piece he could see. It changed everything. This wasn't just a case of a lonely child or a problem at school. This was something deeper, something that involved the sterile, scary world of hospitals and sickness. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in his gut, that he could no longer be just a silent observer. He had to know more. The thought of what he was planning to do made him feel uneasy, even a little sick to his stomach. It was an invasion of privacy, a betrayal of the unspoken trust between a driver and his passengers. He would be furious if someone went through his personal belongings. But this was different. This was a child, a little girl who was crying every single day, a child who was carrying a secret so heavy it was crushing her small shoulders. The image of her terrified face as she grabbed the bracelet kept playing in his mind. That wasn't the look of a child who was just being private. That was the look of someone who was protecting a fragile, desperate secret. He felt that if he didn't do something, he would be failing her, failing the most basic human duty to care for one another. The risk of overstepping felt small compared to the risk of letting her continue to carry this burden all alone. Finally, his shift ended. He guided the big bus into its parking spot at the depot, the engine sighing to a halt for the last time that day. He went through his end-of-route checklist, his hands moving automatically, but his heart was pounding in his chest. He waited until the other drivers had left, until the depot was quiet and empty. The only sounds the distant hum of a fluorescent light and the tick of the bus's cooling engine. The silence felt heavy, sacred. He took a deep breath, the air smelling of diesel and damp floor cleaner. This was it. There was no turning back. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the empty bus. It felt strange to be walking through his workplace when it wasn't filled with people. The seats seemed bigger, the aisles wider. He stopped at the third row, at the girl's seat. It looked just like any other seat, but to him it felt like a holy place, a small shrine to a hidden sorrow. He hesitated for a moment, a final wave of doubt washing over him. What if he was wrong? What if this was all a big misunderstanding? But then he saw a small, dark corner under the seat where something was tucked away. His resolve hardened. He knelt down, his knees cracking slightly, the floor cool and gritty beneath them. He peered into the darkness. Tucked deep into the corner, almost out of sight, were two objects. One was a small, worn sketchbook with a bright blue cover, the corners scuffed and bent. The other was a small drawstring bag made of a faded, floral print cloth. With hands that trembled slightly, he reached in and pulled them out. They felt heavier than they looked, weighted with more than just their physical mass. He sat down in the seat, the same seat the girl sat in every day, and placed the items on his lap. For a moment, he just looked at them, feeling like he was holding her entire world in his hands. He opened the sketchbook first. The pages were thick with crayon drawings, the kind a child makes with a fierce, concentrated energy. The first few pages were filled with bright, happy colors. There was a drawing of a woman with long, dark hair and a big, wide smile, holding the hand of a little girl with messy brown hair. They were in a park under a huge, smiling yellow sun. In another drawing, they were on a swing set, flying high into a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The woman in the drawings was clearly the girl's mother. They were pictures of pure, simple joy, captured in waxy crayon strokes, but as he flipped through the pages, the colors began to change. The bright yellows and blues were slowly replaced by grays and pale, washed-out pinks. The sun disappeared from the sky. In one drawing, the woman was lying in a bed, but she was still smiling. In the next, there were tubes and wires around her, drawn in shaky black lines. The girl was sitting in a chair next to the bed, her body small and her face sad. The drawings continued like this, a silent, visual story of a long illness. The woman's smile grew weaker with each page. The hospital room became more prominent, the machines more complex. In one particularly heartbreaking picture, the girl was trying to hand the woman a flower, but her arm wasn't long enough to reach the bed. He reached the last page in the sketchbook. His breath caught in his throat. It was a drawing of the inside of a bus. The view was from a window seat, looking out at a blurry city. In the seat, a small figure with messy brown hair was sitting alone, her face buried in her hands. Blue crayon tears rained down on the page. It was her. It was a drawing of her, crying on his bus. The man felt a chill go down his spine, even though the air in the bus was warm. This was her diary, her story, told in the only way she could. She wasn't just a sad little girl. She was a little girl watching her mother get sicker, and the bus ride was her only time to let it all out, her only private moment to fall apart. He closed the sketchbook gently, his heart aching. He then turned his attention to the small cloth bag. It was tied shut with a simple knot. He undid it and peered inside. He expected to see more crayons, maybe a small toy, or a keepsake from her mother. But what he saw made him gasp. The bag was not filled with toys. It was filled with money. It was a jumble of coins, a collection of pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters. It was heavy, a surprisingly dense weight of metal in the soft cloth bag. He poured a little into his palm. The coins were tarnished and dirty, some so old he barely recognized them. They looked like they had been collected from couch cushions, from sidewalk cracks, from piggy banks that had been emptied long ago. This wasn't allowance money. This was a small, desperate fortune, saved up coin by painful coin, and in that moment it all clicked into place. The sketchbook, the coins, the hospital bracelet, the tears, the heavy backpack, the secret panic in her eyes. It all made a horrible, heartbreaking kind of sense. This little girl wasn't just sad. She was on a mission. She was saving up every penny she could find, carrying it with her every day, all in a desperate, childlike attempt to do something, to buy medicine, to make her mother better, to fix a problem that was far too big for a 7-year-old to handle. The shock that hit him wasn't one of surprise or confusion. It was a profound, gut-wrenching wave of empathy and sorrow, so powerful it almost took his breath away. He leaned his head back against the seat, the sketchbook in one hand and the bag of coins in the other, and for the first time in a very long time, the bus driver felt like he might cry himself. The night that followed was the longest the man had ever experienced. Sleep was a country he couldn't find a map to. Every time he closed his eyes, the images from the sketchbook would flash across the back of his eyelids like a silent movie. The bright, happy sun, the woman's smiling face, the swings flying high towards a perfect blue sky. Then the colors would fade, the sun would disappear, and the hospital room would take over, stark and gray. He saw the tubes, the wires, the weakening smile, and finally, the heartbreaking image of the little girl, alone on his bus, crying rivers of blue crayon tears. He got out of bed and walked to his kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water. His hands were unsteady. The weight of the small, cloth bag of coins felt like it was still in his pocket, a heavy, jangling reminder of the girl's desperate, secret mission. He had to do something. The question was no longer if, but how. He knew that returning the sketchbook and the money was not just about giving back lost items. It was about crossing a line, stepping out from behind his wheel and into her life. It was a conversation he knew he couldn't avoid. The next morning, the world felt sharper, more defined. The sun rising over the city looked different. The sounds of the morning traffic seemed more urgent. As he started his pre-trip inspection of the bus, his hands moved with a new sense of purpose. He checked the tires, the lights, the brakes, but his mind was already on the afternoon, on the 3:15 stop at the city library. He placed the sketchbook and the cloth bag of coins carefully in a small storage compartment beneath the driver's seat, hidden from view but close at hand. He felt a strange mix of fear and resolve, a tight knot in his stomach that was part anxiety and part determination. He was about to break all the rules, not for himself, but for her. And that made it feel right. The morning and early afternoon passed in a tense, slow-motion crawl. Every passenger who boarded the bus, every stop he made, was just a countdown to the moment he was both dreading and anticipating. He found himself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, his eyes constantly flicking to the clock on the dashboard. When the time finally came, he felt his heart rate pick up its pace. He slowed the bus as he approached the library stop, his eyes scanning the sidewalk. And there she was, just as she always was, a small, solitary figure standing on the pavement. She looked even smaller today, even more fragile, as if a strong wind might blow her away. As she boarded the bus and placed her fare in the coin dispenser, she didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the floor. He gave her a quiet nod, his throat too tight to speak. She took her usual seat in the third row. The man watched her in the mirror as the bus pulled back into traffic. She settled in, her backpack beside her, and stared out the window. He saw the familiar ritual begin. The slight tremble in her shoulders, the quick, furtive wipe of a hand across her cheek. The silent tears had started their daily descent. But today it was different. He wasn't just a sad observer. He was the keeper of her secret, the silent witness to her pain, and soon he would be her confidant. He drove for a few more blocks, his mind racing, rehearsing what he would say. There was no script for this. He just had to speak from his heart. He made his decision. Instead of continuing towards the next stop, he slowed the bus and guided it gently to the curb, pulling over in a quiet stretch of road between two intersections. He turned on his hazard lights, the soft, rhythmic blinking a strange, urgent heartbeat in the quiet afternoon. Then he did something that would change everything. He turned off the engine. The sudden silence was immediate and absolute. The low hum of the engine, the constant companion on every journey, was gone. The air in the bus grew still. A few passengers looked up from their phones, confused, glancing towards the front. The little girl turned her head, her eyes wide with alarm, her body tensing as she prepared to flee. The man took a deep breath, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stood up. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps the only sound in the quiet bus. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, but he didn't care. His world had shrunk to the third row, to the small, frightened girl sitting by the window. He stopped beside her seat, and, in a move he hoped would show he was no threat, he knelt down on one knee, bringing himself to her level. He held the sketchbook in his hands, its bright blue cover looking impossibly cheerful in the tense silence. "I think you dropped this," he said, his voice softer than he ever thought it could be. "I found it under the seat yesterday." The girl stared at the sketchbook, her face a mask of disbelief and terror. Her eyes darted from the book to his face and back again. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared as if she were seeing a ghost. The man decided to push a little further, to show her he understood. "You're a very good artist," he said gently. "I saw your drawings. The ones of you and your mom in the park. They're beautiful. Is this your mom?" That was the final crack in the dam. The mention of her mother, the gentle compliment, the sight of her private world in his hands, it was too much. A small, choked sound escaped her throat, like a sob that had been trapped for a lifetime. Her face crumpled, the brave facade she had worn for so many months finally shattering into a million pieces. The silent tears turned into loud, heartbreaking sobs that racked her small body. She buried her face in her hands and cried, not with the quiet dignity she had shown before, but with the raw, painful release of a child who could no longer be strong. The man didn't say anything else. He just stayed there, kneeling on the floor of the bus, a silent, steady presence in the storm of her grief. He let her cry, knowing she needed this, needed to let it all out. After a few moments, she looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes pleading. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to lose it." "It's okay," the man said, his voice full of a warmth he didn't know he possessed. "You don't have to be sorry. Can you tell me what's wrong? Is your mom sick?" The girl nodded, a fresh wave of tears washing over her. "She's in the hospital," she choked out. "She's been there for a long time. The doctors are trying to make her better, but it's not working." She looked down at the cloth bag he was still holding. "I've been saving my money," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "From my lunch and from the tooth fairy? I thought if I had enough, I could buy her the good medicine. The kind that really works." The man felt his own eyes fill with tears. He reached out and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it was filled with all the compassion and care he had been holding back for months. "Oh, honey," he said, the word coming out naturally. "That is the most loving thing I have ever heard. But you can't do this all by yourself. You shouldn't have to." He looked her straight in the eye, his expression serious but kind. "You listen to me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You are not alone in this. You hear me? You are not alone. We are going to get you and your mom some help. I promise you. We will do this together." The girl looked at him, her sobs slowly subsiding, a tiny flicker of hope in her tear-filled eyes. For the first time in a long time, she didn't look like a little girl carrying the weight of the world. She looked like a child who had just been found. The promise hung in the air of the silent bus, a fragile but powerful thing. The man kept his hand on the girl's shoulder, feeling the small tremors that still ran through her body. He knew he couldn't just leave her at her stop and drive away, not after what he had just promised. The other passengers were watching, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern, but he didn't care. His world had narrowed to this one child, this one moment that needed to be handled with infinite care. "Okay," he said softly, his voice a calm anchor in her storm of emotion. "We're going to figure this out. But first I need to get you home safe. Is there someone waiting for you?" The girl shook her head. "I let myself in," she whispered. "My grandma comes later, after she gets off work." A new wave of worry washed over him. She was going home to an empty house. "All right," he said, making a quick decision. "I'm going to finish my route, and then I'm going to come back and check on you. Is that okay?" The girl looked at him, her tear-streaked face unsure, but she nodded slowly. He gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze before standing up and walking back to the driver's seat. He started the engine, the low hum filling the silence, and guided the bus back into traffic. The rest of the route felt surreal. He was a bus driver again, but he was also a keeper of a promise, a man on a mission. When he finally pulled up to her stop, he watched her walk to a small apartment building and disappear inside before he drove away. His heart heavy with a new sense of responsibility. The next morning was his day off. But he was up with the sun, his mind already racing. He knew he couldn't solve this problem alone, but he didn't know where to start. He wasn't a rich man or a powerful man. He was just a guy who drove a bus. But he had a phone and a story, and he hoped that would be enough. He spent the morning making calls, his hands feeling clumsy and his throat dry. He finally found the number for a local community outreach center, a place that helped families in need. He was nervous when a woman answered, her voice brisk and professional. He stumbled through his story, telling her about the little girl on his bus, the tears, the sketchbook, and the bag of coins. He was careful not to give her name, explaining that he wanted to protect her privacy. To his surprise, the woman on the other end of the line didn't dismiss him. She listened patiently, her silence encouraging him to tell her everything. When he was finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Sir," she said, her voice now soft and full of emotion, "you did the right thing by calling us. This is exactly the kind of situation we are here for. We can't share information with you about the family, but we can certainly look into it. Thank you for caring so much." Then she added, "A story like this, it could really help. Have you thought about talking to a news reporter?" The idea of talking to the news was terrifying. He was a private person, a man who was more comfortable with the hum of an engine than the sound of his own voice on a recording. But he thought of the girl's face, of the desperate hope in her eyes. He knew he had to try. The woman at the center gave him the name of a reporter she knew, a kind woman who often covered human interest stories. He made the call, his heart pounding. The reporter agreed to meet him at a small coffee shop near the bus depot that afternoon. He brought the sketchbook with him, having called the girl's grandmother that morning to explain everything and to ask for her permission. The grandmother, overwhelmed with gratitude, had agreed. As he sat in the noisy coffee shop, he told the reporter the whole story, from the first silent tear to the shocking discovery under the seat. He showed her the drawings, his finger tracing the path from the happy, sunny park to the gray hospital room and the lonely bus seat. The reporter listened, her pen flying across her notepad, her eyes wide with disbelief and compassion. She didn't just see a news story. She saw a real-life tragedy and a quiet hero in a bus driver's uniform. That evening, the story aired on the local news. The man sat in his living room, watching his own face on the television screen, feeling like he was in a dream. The reporter told his story with sensitivity and grace, showing the drawings from the sketchbook on the screen, blurring the girl's face to protect her identity. The segment ended with an appeal to the community, with information on how to donate to a fund the news station had set up for the family. The man didn't know what to expect. Maybe a few people would donate a little money. He hoped it would be enough to help with a medical bill or two. But he had severely underestimated the power of a small town with a big heart. The next morning, his phone rang off the hook. It was the news station, the community center, people he hadn't heard from in years. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from every corner of the city, not just from rich people, but from ordinary folks who were touched by the story. $100 here, $20 there, a child's $5 allowance. It all added up. A local pizzeria called the news station and offered to deliver a hot meal to the family's home every single day, free of charge. A retired nurse who lived on the man's bus route saw the story and called the outreach center, offering to go sit with the girl's mother in the hospital so she wouldn't be alone. A local clothing store dropped off a box of warm winter coats for the little girl. The man was inundated with messages of thanks and support. People were stopping him on the street, recognizing him from the news, shaking his hand and thanking him for what he had done. He was still just a bus driver, but he felt like he was a part of something much, much bigger. A week later, the man was back behind the wheel of the number 12 bus. As he approached the library stop, he felt that familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. What if nothing had really changed? What if the help wasn't enough? He saw her standing at the stop, but something was different. She was wearing a new, bright red jacket, and it looked warm and puffy. She boarded the bus, and for the first time, she looked right at him and gave him a small, shy smile. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She took her usual seat, but she didn't cry. She just sat there, looking out the window, a small, contented smile on her face. The man watched her in the mirror, his own heart feeling lighter than it had in months. The heavy burden had been lifted, not just from her shoulders, but from his as well. When the bus reached her stop, she gathered her things and walked to the front. But this time, she didn't just rush past him. She stopped right beside his seat. "I have something for you," she said, her voice clear and strong. She held out a piece of paper. It was a new drawing. He took it, his hands trembling slightly. It was a picture of a woman with a big smile, sitting in a sunny room filled with flowers. Outside the window, a big yellow bus was parked, and in the driver's seat, a man with a kind face was waving. It was him. At the bottom of the page, in careful, wobbly letters, she had written 2 words, "Thank you." The man looked at the drawing, then at the girl's happy, smiling face. He felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the bus's heater. He was still just a bus driver, a simple man in a simple job. But he now knew that even the smallest act of kindness, a simple decision to notice and to care, could create a ripple that could change a life and even an entire community. He smiled back at the girl, a real, genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "You're very welcome," he said. And as he watched her walk down the street, her new red jacket a bright spot of hope in the afternoon sun, he knew that he would never see his job or his world in the same way ever again.